Sunset Boulevard was not what the movies showed. In 1958, it stretched 22 miles across Beverly Hills, Hollywood, and the western suburbs of Los Angeles. And every foot of that asphalt carried a layer that Hollywood cameras never framed. In the deed records of Los Angeles County, property titles along that corridor contained printed clauses prohibiting the sale of homes to Black people, Japanese, Filipinos, and Mexicans. These were not rare documents. According to researchers at Stanford University, by 1950, 1 in every 4 properties in California was subject to racially restrictive covenants, formally recorded contractual restrictions on who could own a home. The Supreme Court had declared those covenants judicially unenforceable in 1948 in the case Shelley versus Kramer. They kept being written into the deeds. What nobody told was that the conformity of the 1950s was not just aesthetic, it was a system. And in 1958, that system was quietly beginning to crack. This starts before the asphalt. When American soldiers came home from the Second World War in 1945 and 1946, the federal government had a plan for them. The plan had a name, the Federal Housing Administration, and it had a precise mechanism: subsidized mortgages with minimum down payments for white families to buy new homes in the expanding suburbs. California was the destination. Los Angeles specifically grew faster than any other American city in the post-war period. Sunset Boulevard was not the Hollywood of studios and movie stars. It was the axis of the dream suburb. New neighborhoods, 2-bedroom houses, front lawns, single-car garages. A model replicated hundreds of times along the western corridor. In 1958, Los Angeles County had more than 700 active residential subdivisions. The boom was real, the numbers were real, but the federal loans came with a condition that rarely appears in school textbooks. The Federal Housing Administration, since 1934, refused to guarantee mortgages in neighborhoods classified as racially mixed. The classification system, created by the Homeowners Loan Corporation in the 1930s, divided neighborhoods into 4 categories: green for most desirable, red for hazardous. The green neighborhoods were white, the red ones were not. The 1950 Los Angeles map made that visible to anyone who wanted to look. Most people preferred not to look. The Federal Housing Administration did not merely tolerate racially restrictive covenants in property deeds. Its underwriting manual, in effect from 1936 to 1952, actively recommended that federally financed neighborhoods include this type of contractual protection as a guarantee of investment stability. That language was in the official manual of an American federal agency. It was not informal policy, it was written policy. Sunset Boulevard in 1958 was therefore the direct product of deliberate federal engineering, and the families who bought their homes along that corridor between 1945 and 1958, most of them did not know exactly what they had signed, or they knew and preferred not to think about it. The deed said the house was theirs. What the deed did not say was that it contained clauses defining who the next neighbor could be. Racially restrictive covenants were not an anomaly of the American South. They were born in Los Angeles. The first racially restrictive covenant formally recorded in Los Angeles County dates to 1902. The Los Angeles Realty Board, the city's real estate brokers association, ran a systematic campaign to include those clauses in as many new subdivisions as possible from its founding in 1903. Decades before any federal law, Los Angeles brokers had already turned discrimination into standard market procedure. The clause worked like this. The purchase contract for a property included a restriction prohibiting the resale or rental of that property to Black people, Japanese, Filipinos, Chinese, or Mexicans. The list varied by deed, but the logic was always the same. In some contracts, there was an additional clause. If the covenant was violated, the property reverted to the original deed holder. The house could be taken back. The Supreme Court declared those covenants judicially unenforceable in 1948 in the case Shelley versus Kramer. The ruling was clear. No American court could be used to enforce a racial covenant. What the courts did not do was erase the documents.
According to research published in the Northwestern University Law Review, racial covenants continued to be added to new deeds throughout the 1950s because there was no law prohibiting the inclusion of the clause, only a law preventing its judicial enforcement. The difference is subtle. In practice, it meant that a seller who wanted to keep his neighborhood homogeneous could simply refuse to sell to whoever he chose, with or without the formal clause, and no court would compel him. The Federal Housing Administration's Underwriting Manual of 1938 had been explicit. The agency recommended that federally guaranteed neighborhoods include restrictions prohibiting the occupation of properties except by the race for which they were intended. The 1947 version and the 1958 revision removed the direct reference to race, but instructed lenders to consider physical and social factors of neighborhood stability. The language changed, the logic remained. And alongside the formal covenants, there was a second parallel system of control: homeowners associations. Los Angeles homeowners associations had documented roots going back to 1916, when the Los Feliz Improvement Association was created to ensure architectural consistency and property maintenance. In the post-war boom of the 40s and 50s, homeowners associations multiplied across every new subdivision. They regulated facade color, lawn height, fence type, permitted noise hours, and the vehicle models allowed in the driveway. Uniformity was the product. The house was worth more if the neighbors were identical. To buy on Sunset Boulevard in 1958, a family had to pass through two invisible filters: the banks, which used the Federal Housing Administration's risk maps, and the homeowners associations, which had its own unwritten criteria, but widely understood ones. There was no manual for the second filter. Everyone knew how it worked. In 1958, the average price of a residential home along the Sunset Boulevard corridor in the Bel Air and Beverly Hills sections was approximately $35,000.
In more accessible suburbs of the Western Corridor, such as Brentwood and West Hollywood, the price hovered around $18,500. For a family with the American median income of $5,100 per year in 1958, that house represented more than 3 years of gross wages. It was the largest investment of a lifetime, and there was a perverse logic to it. The higher the investment, the greater the resistance to any threat of devaluation. The Federal Housing Administration's risk maps had taught homeowners that racial diversity meant falling prices. It was not just prejudice. It was, for many of those homeowners, financial calculation. The house was the retirement fund. The uniformity of the neighborhood was the guarantee. Life magazine and Look magazine did the rest of the work.
The highest circulation magazines in the United States in the 1950s regularly published photographs of California suburbs as the model of prosperity: the family on the porch, the new car in the garage, the barbecue in the backyard. The images always showed the same pattern, the same composition, the same skin color, the same cut of grass. The aspiration was uniform because the advertising was uniform. In 1958, Los Angeles County recorded more than 700 active residential subdivisions. Many of them were identical. Same floor plan, same facade, same distance between windows. Architecture critics of the era called it ticky-tacky, a term that would make its way into a song a few years later in 1962 when Malvina Reynolds wrote Little Boxes while looking at the hills of Daly City, California. But in 1958, there was still no song for it. There was only the silence of someone who lives in a perfect house and cannot name what is missing.
And there was a second, less visible phenomenon. The pressure to conform was not only architectural. Solomon Asch had published his experiments on social conformity between 1951 and 1956, demonstrating in a laboratory setting that ordinary people denied obvious evidence in front of their own eyes when the social group around them confirmed the wrong version. His results were widely discussed in popular American psychology magazines in the second half of the 1950s. Asch called it compliance, conformity without conviction. You know you are wrong. You say you are right because the group says so. The California suburb of 1958 was an ash experiment at full scale. The homeowners associations guaranteed that the facade was always painted the right color. The banks guaranteed that the neighbor fit the right profile. The magazines guaranteed that you wanted to be exactly like the neighbor.
And then came 1957. Sputnik was launched in October of 1957, a metal sphere 23 inches across, broadcasting a radio signal over American territory every 96 minutes. For the families who heard that beep through the living room radio, it was the first visible crack in the idea that the perfect suburban world was safe. The recession of 1957 to 1958 was the second crack. The American economy contracted 3.7% between August of 1957 and April of 1958. Property prices in Los Angeles County felt it. It was not a collapse, it was a tremor. But enough for some of the owners of those perfect houses to start doing the math. The house that had been a certainty became a variable. And for some residents of the Sunset Corridor, the most unsettling variable was not Sputnik and not the recession. It was the neighbor trying to buy the house on the corner. 14 miles south of Sunset Boulevard, for Black families in Los Angeles in the 1950s, Compton was the attainable dream, the affordable version of the same suburb that the Sunset Corridor represented for white families. New houses, front lawns, public schools, garages, the same product, a different address. Before the Second World War, Compton was 95% white. It had adopted racially restrictive covenants since 1921, the same documents prohibiting sales to Black people, Japanese, and Mexicans. After Shelley versus Kramer in 1948, the clauses lost their judicial force. Black families began to buy. Some were welcomed with vandalism. The records document the pattern. Broken windows, defaced walls, threats delivered by mail. These were not isolated incidents. They were the organized response of homeowners associations that had lost their legal instrument, but not their willingness to act. Brokers accelerated the process from the other side, spreading word among white families that the arrival of Black neighbors would drive down property values. It worked. They called it blockbusting. The broker bought cheap from panicking white families, sold high to Black families who had few options, profited on both ends. By 1958, Compton had a 40% Black population, up from nearly zero in 1940. That same year, a Black man ran for city council in Compton for the first time. He was not elected. The first Black council member in Compton would be elected 3 years later in 1961. The mechanism was identical to Solomon Ashe's. Ashe's experiment showed that individuals capitulate to group pressure even when they know the group is wrong. What he could not measure in the laboratory was the material cost of resisting. Compton in 1957 and 1958, the cost was concrete. Destroyed property, hostile neighbors, banks refusing to refinance in neighborhoods deemed in transition. Resisting the mold was not just courage. It was calculated financial loss, and many who resisted paid the price twice. The visible crack in the system was Compton, but the invisible crack was higher up. Inside the homes of the Sunset Corridor, in the dining rooms where teenage children listened to rock and roll on the radio and could not understand why it bothered the adults so much. The system had produced perfect conformity for 10 years. The children had not signed the contract. In October of 1957, the living room radio picked up a new sound. It was not rock and roll. It was a beep. Steady, metallic, transmitted at 20.005 megahertz and 40.002 megahertz, audible on any shortwave receiver. It was Sputnik, orbiting at 560 miles above the California suburbs. Sputnik did not destroy Sunset Boulevard, but it did something more subtle. It proved, beyond any argument, that the perfect suburban world was exposed. 4 months later, the recession arrived. The economic contraction of 1957 to 1958 was the most severe since the end of the war. The American gross domestic product declined 3.7% between August of 1957 and April of 1958. Unemployment in the United States rose to 7.4%. In Los Angeles County, the real estate market felt it, not with the dramatic collapse that would come decades later, but with the kind of hesitation that frightens homeowners who built an entire retirement on top of an address. The banks grew more cautious, so did the buyers.
That same year, at Los Angeles radio stations, parent associations sent letters requesting that stations stop playing rock and roll during hours when children might be listening. Records from the Los Angeles Times of the period document the debate. The music was described as wild, primitive, incompatible with the values of the American home. The language was the same as the real estate campaign. What does not fit the mold devalues the whole. And then, in March of 1958, the California state legislature held hearings on housing discrimination in the state. Nothing was passed yet. But the fact that the subject was being discussed publicly in Sacramento was, for the homeowners associations of Los Angeles, the kind of threat that did not come from the outside. It came from within. 1 year later, in 1959, California would pass 2 legal instruments that would begin to dismantle the system.
The first was the California Fair Employment and Housing Act, which created the first state mechanism for investigating and penalizing housing discrimination. The second was the Unruh Civil Rights Act, which prohibited discrimination by commercial establishments, including real estate agencies and property management companies. These were laws, not miracles. Discrimination did not disappear with them. And 4 years later, in 1963, when California passed the Rumford Act prohibiting discrimination across the entire real estate market, the backlash was immediate. In 1964, a majority of Californians voted for Proposition 14 to repeal the law. The California Supreme Court was forced to declare Proposition 14 unconstitutional in 1966. The children who grew up in the houses on Sunset Boulevard in 1958 were between 18 and 25 years old in 1966. They were the ones voting. They were the ones marching, and they were the ones in some cases selling their parents' houses at prices no one in 1958 could have predicted. The irony documented in Los Angeles real estate data is precise and uncomfortable. The neighborhoods that appreciated the most between 1970 and 1980 along the Los Angeles corridor were not the ones that maintained forced demographic uniformity. They were the ones that went through transition. According to historical property appreciation data from Beverly Hills and West Los Angeles, homes in that region multiplied in value between 5 and 7 times over the course of the 1970s. The mechanism was straightforward. Neighborhoods that resisted change stagnated. Those that absorbed the transition and survived the turbulence of the 60s entered the next decade's appreciation wave with a broader base. The families who sold in panic in the 1950s and 60s, convinced by brokers that the arrival of black neighbors would destroy their property values, sold cheap. They sold to the brokers. The brokers resold at a premium. The blockbusting that devastated Compton in the 1950s was, in essence, a forced transfer of wealth from panicking white families to the middlemen who profited from fear. Black families paid the inflated price. White families forfeited the future appreciation. The only consistent winner was the broker. In 1959, California passed the California Fair Employment and Housing Act, creating the first state mechanism for investigating housing discrimination. That same year, the Unruh Civil Rights Act prohibited discrimination by commercial establishments, including real estate agencies and property management companies. 2 laws in 12 months. The system did not surrender so easily. In 1963, the Rumford Fair Housing Act went further. It explicitly prohibited discrimination across the entire California real estate market. The reaction was immediate. 1 year later, in November of 1964, 65% of Californians voted for Proposition 14, which amended the state constitution to repeal the Rumford Act and guarantee the right of any property owner to refuse to sell or rent to whoever they chose, without having to give a reason. 65% of Californians. Many of them lived along the Sunset Corridor. Many of them had children who, that same November of 1964, were on California university campuses questioning exactly what their parents were defending. The California Supreme Court declared Proposition 14 unconstitutional in 1966. The United States Supreme Court confirmed the ruling in 1967 in the case Reitman versus Mulkey. The legal system held against the will of the majority, but the vote of 65% of Californians in 1964 revealed something that no deed in any courthouse had ever revealed so clearly. The conformity of the 1950s had not been merely a top-down imposition. It was in significant part a choice. Sunset Boulevard still exists. The 22 miles that cross Hollywood, Beverly Hills, and the western corridor of Los Angeles can still be driven in under an hour. The two-bedroom houses from the 1950s are still there, many renovated, some demolished, few identical to what they once were. What also still exists are the documents. In February of 2024, Los Angeles County announced that it had hired a company for approximately $8 million to locate and redact the discriminatory clauses from millions of property deeds still active in the county's archives. The process, according to the county itself, will take at least 7 years. That means that in 2024, deeds containing racially restrictive language were still being passed from owner to owner in ordinary real estate transactions, inherited without the buyers necessarily knowing what they were receiving along with the keys. Assembly Bill 1466, signed into law in California in September of 2021, authorized property owners to formally request the removal of those clauses from their deeds. The process is voluntary. The form can be submitted by mail to the Los Angeles County Recorder's Office in Norwalk. Millions of deeds are still waiting. The Compton that was destroyed by blockbusting in the 1950s and that lost approximately 60,000 white residents in less than a decade emerged in the 1970s as a majority black city, with the fiscal consequences that a forced transfer of wealth produces: a narrower tax base, weaker public services, underfunded schools. Segregation had ended on paper. The effects continued in the asphalt, and the children who grew up in those houses on Sunset Boulevard in 1958. Most of them never read their parents' deeds. Some still have them in a drawer. The Los Angeles County Recorder's Office at the address 12,400 Imperial Highway in Norwalk, California, maintains the physical records of every property deed in the county going back to the 19th century. The documentation of the covenants that structured Sunset Boulevard in 1958 can be reviewed today, not as a historical curiosity, but as an active record still attached to properties that are worth, in some stretches of that corridor, more than $2 million. The California Dream of 1958 is still on file at the courthouse, along with the clauses that decided who was allowed to have it.